The United States owes 36 trillion. China owes 15 trillion. Japan owes 10 trillion. Germany owes 3 trillion. The UK owes 3 trillion. France owes 3.5 trillion. Every major nation on earth is in debt. Total global debt is 317 trillion. $317 trillion. So that's 330% of global GDP. Every dollar of production on earth doesn't equal the total debt. We'd need 3 years of global output with zero consumption to pay it off. But here's the question nobody asks. If everyone is in debt, who is the creditor? Who holds $317 trillion in assets if the rest of the world holds $317 trillion in liabilities? Debt is a zero-sum game. For every borrower, there's a lender. If the United States owes $36 trillion, someone owns $36 trillion in claims on the United States. If global debt is $317 trillion, someone owns $317 trillion in global assets. Who? The answer reveals the largest wealth concentration mechanism in human history, not through conquest, not through theft, through a system where the many borrow and the few lend, where interest compounds forever, and where debt mathematically cannot be repaid, so it grows perpetually while funneling wealth upward. Here's who actually holds the $317 trillion in global debt, how the system creates debt without creating money to repay it, why this is intentional design, not accidental crisis, which specific institutions and individuals profit from perpetual debt, and why the system must eventually collapse, but only after maximum extraction. Understanding this isn't about economics. It's about seeing that the global debt system is the mechanism by which wealth concentrates in fewer hands, while making that concentration appear natural and inevitable. Before we identify who holds the debt, you need to understand what debt actually is in the modern system. Most people think debt works like personal borrowing. You borrow $10,000 from a bank. The bank had $10,000 and lent it to you. When you repay, the bank gets its $10,000 back plus interest. This is not how modern debt works. When a government borrows money by issuing bonds, the money doesn't exist before the borrowing. The act of borrowing creates the money. The central bank or commercial banks buy the government bonds by creating money from nothing through ledger entries. The U.S. government needs $1 trillion. It issues treasury bonds. The Federal Reserve announces it will buy $500 billion of those bonds. Commercial banks buy the other $500 billion. Where does the Federal Reserve get $500 billion? It doesn't have it. It creates the money by typing numbers into a computer. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet increases by $500 billion in assets and $500 billion in liabilities. The commercial banks do something similar through fractional reserve banking. The money didn't exist before. It exists now because of the bond purchase. When the U.S. government borrows $1 trillion, that $1 trillion is created through the borrowing process. But here's the critical part. Only the principal is created. The interest is not created. If the government borrows $1 trillion at 5% interest, it must repay $1 trillion plus $50 billion interest per year. But only $1 trillion was created. The $50 billion to pay interest must come from somewhere else. Where? From future borrowing or from taxing the existing money supply? This creates a mathematical trap. Total debt always exceeds total money supply because interest is owed on debt but was never created. The system requires perpetual growth in debt just to service existing debt. This is not a bug. This is the design. Now let me show you who holds the debt. The answer is 4 categories of creditors: central banks, institutional investors, foreign governments, and wealthy individuals. First category, central banks. The Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion in U.S. government debt. The Bank of Japan holds $5 trillion in Japanese government debt. The European Central Bank holds $5 trillion in European government debt. The People's Bank of China holds $3 trillion in Chinese government debt. Central banks, globally, hold approximately $25 trillion in government bonds. This is 8% of the $317 trillion total debt, but it's the foundation because central banks create money to buy government bonds, enabling governments to spend beyond tax revenue. But who owns the central banks? The Federal Reserve is not government-owned. It's a private institution owned by member banks. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks issue shares to member commercial banks. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo receive a 6% annual dividend on their Federal Reserve shares. When the Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion in government bonds and receives interest, that interest ultimately flows to the private banks that own the Federal Reserve. The public believes the Federal Reserve is part of the government. It's not. It's a private banking cartel created in 1913 to allow private banks to profit from government debt. The Bank of England, created in 1694,